Live from the world headquarters of RT America in our nation's capital, this is the news with Rick Sanchez.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez, and I want to welcome our viewers from around the world, including those of you who are watching us on the portable TV app. As we begin this newscast, the United States Secretary of State is embarking on a foreign trip that seems aimed at encouraging allies and threatening adversaries. All this while leaders of China and Russia and Iran and many others gather for a summit where the U.S.'s heavy hand and implementation of sanctions are roundly denounced. In fact, just this week, the U.S. leveled new sanctions against China, Iran, and Russia, where the target really seems to be, at least in the case of Russia, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that Washington is vehemently against. What is most interesting about all of this is the timing. It's happening just 10 days after a U.S. presidential election where the Associated Press has called the race for President-elect Biden. That's why questions are now being asked about the real intent of Mr. Pompeo's trip. Is it to smooth relations on an ongoing basis, or is he there to assure allies that the Trump administration is there to stay? As he, by the way, interestingly enough, recently suggested.
It will be a smooth transition to a second Trump administration.
We're going to drill down on this right here on the News with Rick Sanchez, where we believe that it's time to do news again. Here's the list of the questions we think you'll be asking tomorrow. Why the sudden push by the U.S. Secretary of State overseas? Is the Trump camp making any headway on its election challenge? Is the Prime Minister of Armenia suddenly in hiding? But we're going to begin with this trifecta I just told you about: more U.S. sanctions, a summit among countries protesting said sanctions, and a somewhat bewildering foreign trip by Mike Pompeo to places like Georgia, Israel, Saudi Arabia, France. I could go on. RT correspondent Alex Mihailovich reports on the summit.
It is a gathering of some of the world's most populous and influential nations. This year, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit was held online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus was one of the topics which received much-needed attention from the participants.
There are already 2 registered vaccines in Russia, and moreover, studies have shown and confirmed that, firstly, these vaccines are safe. There are no serious consequences after their use, and secondly, they are all effective. 2 have been registered, and a 3rd vaccine will be registered soon. We propose not to politicize all these processes and to proceed from the fact that people on the whole planet today, without any exaggeration, need such drugs. We are ready to work with all countries of the world and, of course, with our partners within the SCO.
In addition to the ongoing pandemic, SCO member states China, India, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Russia, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan discussed international relations, with the topic of the United States being raised more than once. Without mentioning names, Chinese President Xi Jinping told SCO partner states to oppose interference from external forces. She said, "The world is entering a period of turbulence and transformation. The international community now faces a major test with choices to be made between multilateralism and unilateralism, openness and seclusion, cooperation and confrontation." Tensions between China and the U.S. have hit new highs during the time of the Trump administration. Xi's warning against rising unilateralism alluded to America's backing out of international treaties like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who is currently on a tour of Europe and the Middle East, has said that Trump's government was not finished yet with China. To that point, Russia, Iran, and China have all been targeted by new U.S. sanctions this week. The American sanctions are aimed against the Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline project between Russia and Germany, individuals and companies in Iran, as well as 4 Hong Kong officials who are allied to Beijing. Some say this year's meeting of the security organization may be the most important yet, with some member states suffering economically from the impact of the coronavirus, as others deal with territorial issues, namely India and China.
India believes that to enhance connectivity even more deeply, it is important that we move forward while respecting one another's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
After the summit was concluded, a joint statement was released by SCO members, pledging to oppose unilateral actions in international affairs and to promote non-interference in domestic affairs. For RT, I'm Alex Mihailovich.
And now we're joined by political commentator John Jordan, also by Daniel McAdams, the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute. Man, there's a lot of firsts here, gentlemen. A lot of things going on that I don't think I've ever quite seen before. I guess we could start with this summit. I mean, if I had a name for it, which is the non-official name, I would almost call it the Shanghai Summit of Sanctioned Countries, even though that's not the official name. I've never seen countries come together to essentially have a session to complain about sanctions against the United States. But that seems to be what's going on, John.
Absolutely. These are countries, all of whom have been, for various reasons, have been on the receiving end of U.S. sanctions. Certainly, China, when it passed its national security law abridging the rights of Hong Kongers, not only China itself, but a lot of leading Chinese figures found themselves on the receiving end of sanctions. Belarusia, after the Lukashenko, who didn't leave office, found himself on the receiving, certain figures there, and in Russia found themselves being sanctioned too. That's a little harder to understand. And then certainly we have a fresh round of sanctions dealing with Iran. It's also worth noting that all of these countries really have a lot of their own differences too. You know, China and India are having a border conflict of their own, much like they did in October of 1962.
You know, Daniel, I bring you in thinking that perhaps the biggest complainer of sanctions right now is Russia. Russia thinks the United States is meddling in its affairs when it comes to the Nord Stream 2, and that's the real reason for the U.S. sanctions against them. What sayeth you to that?
Well, it's pretty blatant. I mean, this is an example of mercantilism, you know, rather than punishing Russia from some real or imagined fault. Ironically, I would imagine the foreign policy establishment in Washington doesn't even remember why there are sanctions against Russia. Well, it was a boneheaded Obama-Biden foreign policy that overthrew the government of Ukraine that caused the U.S. to have sanctions, and it was a phony Russiagate scandal that was cooked up by the Democrats. So why is the Republican administration maintaining an idiotic foreign policy toward Russia initiated by Obama-Biden? That's the real head scratcher for the past 4 years.
So the real question is, what is Mike Pompeo really up to? I mean, you look at this trip. It happens 10 days after the Associated Press called the race for Biden, which you might say Biden won or didn't win, but to all of a sudden go hopscotching from country to country, talking to these leaders, does leave one scratching their collective heads and saying, what's the real purpose of this trip? Do we know, Mr. Jordan, what the purpose of the trip is?
Well, the trip is largely, you know, it's no small part. It's optical, you know. It's for two reasons: to remind the American, while the election is still being contested in this country, that the Trump administration is still in charge, and to highlight a lot of what the Trump administration is proud of, foreign policy achievements and the path it set the United States on. And the second part is, even if the Trump administration is forced from office, which appears likely, it wants to kind of cement the pivot in American foreign policy that has happened over the last 4 years, especially where Iran is concerned.
Down to 30 seconds, but I want to give it to you, Daniel. Why the visit to Georgia just as there's this huge conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia?
Well, the U.S. can't help itself. It's addicted to meddling. I think what we're seeing here is the neocons having a last-ditch effort. We're seeing Elliot Abrams desperate for a war in the Middle East, desperate to confront Russia. These guys know that they're on their way out. Whether or not Donald Trump survives, they're on their way out. Trump wants to get rid of Pompeo in the second term. May well do that. There's already been essentially a coup at the Pentagon where Colonel Douglas Macgregor has taken over essentially as senior advisor to the incoming Secretary of Defense with the sole purpose of bringing home U.S. troops from Afghanistan, something Trump's own generals refused to do.
Sounds like there's some lack of normalcy right now with everything going on. A lot of moving parts, to say the very least. I'm glad you guys were able to take us through this. Daniel McAdams, John Jordan, my thanks to both of you. Speaking of Armenia, might the Armenian Prime Minister suddenly resign? Many Armenians have spent the past 4 days taking to the streets, demanding the Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan step down. From his last broadcast appearance, he seems to be holed up, hiding possibly in a secret shelter. Why are the protesters so angry in the first place, you might ask? Well, interestingly enough, it's because their government signed a peace deal to stop the fighting with Azerbaijan. Yes, stop the fighting with Azerbaijan. Here's correspondent Yulia Shapovalova with more.
Peace or just truce for Nagorno-Karabakh? According to the ceasefire agreement, Azerbaijan and Armenia must stop all the hostilities and exchange prisoners. Russian peacekeepers will be stationed in the conflict zone. The contingent includes nearly 2,000 military personnel with armored personnel carriers and special equipment. But according to the Russian foreign minister, there is no agreement allowing Turkish peacekeepers to enter Karabakh, even though Turkey previously said it was planning to send a contingent there. The latest is that a no-fly zone has been established over Armenia and the Nagorno-Karabakh region, according to the Armenian Defense Ministry, with exceptions for some flights. So the Russia-brokered agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia on the truce in Nagorno-Karabakh, which came into force on November the 10th, has provoked huge unrest in Yerevan and calls for the resignation of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan. The document was signed after 2 unsuccessful attempts by Armenia to return Shushi, a key city in Nagorno-Karabakh. According to the Armenian authorities, it was a way to avoid a collapse at the front and save 25,000 Armenian soldiers who could have died in the encirclement. The Prime Minister said he put the lives of soldiers above his own political career. He stressed that the decision was an extremely hard one for him, but the one that allowed the country to save other territories that otherwise Karabakh would have lost. 2 years ago, when Pashinyan came to power, he was a national hero, and overnight he's been branded a traitor. Late last night, angry citizens broke into the parliament building. Several dozen people caught and beat up Pashinyan's longtime friend, the Speaker of the Armenian parliament. Plus, the opposition was also preparing a rally against Russia's involvement. Meanwhile, in Baku, the agreement is being celebrated as a victory. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev says the document was of historic importance for his nation and that now the military state is over, it is possible to move on to solve political issues. The territorial dispute between the Armenians and Azerbaijanis has been smoldering for more than a century. The fierce confrontation was extinguished with the establishment of Soviet power in Azerbaijan. During the years of the USSR, there was no open armed confrontation in Nagorno-Karabakh, but the contradictions did not disappear. And 3 decades ago, with the collapse of the USSR, it flared up into a full-blown war. 20,000 people lost their lives and hundreds of thousands became refugees. The region fell under the de facto control of Armenia. Since then, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict was in a frozen state, with both sides vowing to resolve it by force. Analysts say that now Azerbaijan has been much better prepared militarily compared to the previous armed conflict between the states back in the 1990s. So the battles started again on September the 27th this year, with the use of armored vehicles and artillery in the Karabakh conflict zone. An important difference between the new round of the conflict is that hostilities were taking place along the entire front line. There was also an incident with the Russian military helicopter shot down by Azerbaijani air defense systems on the border with Armenia. Azerbaijan has launched an investigation and apologized for what it called a tragic mistake. Yulia Shapovalova with the news of Rick Sanchez.
Thank you, Yulia. That's our first part of our news block. We're coming back with a lot more, so stay where you are. It has now been 5 days since the Associated Press and other media outlets called the 2020 presidential race for President-elect Joe Biden. But President Trump and his legal team continue to pursue claims in court of voter fraud. RT correspondent Natasha Sweet takes a look at the latest, including a conspiracy theory circulating online.
President Donald Trump making his first public appearance on Veterans Day since several media outlets, including the Associated Press, called the 2020 election for Joe Biden. According to Rudy Giuliani, part of the president's legal team, 650,000 ballots cast in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh are deemed unlawful. He says almost none of the hundreds of thousands of those votes counted were observed by Republican poll watchers. According to state election law, someone from each party is supposed to watch the ballots being counted. Matt Morgan, part of Trump's general counsel for his campaign, says a lawsuit in Pennsylvania has been filed against the Secretary of State for at least 2 reasons.
Number one, a violation of equal access based on a lack of meaningful observation and transparency, particularly in Democrat-controlled counties. And secondly, a violation of equal protection based on disparate treatment between Republican voters and Democrat voters.
Trump supporters gathering in front of the state capitol in Lansing, Michigan Wednesday, claiming the election was stolen from President Trump by way of mail-in ballots.
We're on the streets now. Yeah! And we're in front of the state capitals, and we're not leaving until the state legislatures allocate their electoral votes for President Trump for another 4 years.
The demonstration in Michigan was one of 3 Stop the Steal rallies this week. The group met in Madison, Wisconsin Tuesday and are planning a demonstration in Washington, D.C. Saturday. While the support for President Trump remains strong, some are adding to the chaos by sharing purported misinformation online. The theory about an overnight ballot dump for Biden has been circulating. The claim that Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden received 100% of 128,000 new votes counted in Michigan reportedly stems from a typo. Before it was corrected, tweets began circulating. Here, the president is asking what it's all about. A columnist noting that he deleted his original tweet after learning of the typo in one Michigan county. The typo was reportedly made by Caroline Wilson, a Republican clerk. She said she increased Biden's unofficial lead from 15,371 to 153,710 during the morning of November 4th. The error was corrected and President Trump ended up winning the county by more than 8,000 votes. While this one seems to have been sorted out, other voting irregularities linger as the Trump team continues its battle in court. The Republican National Committee saying they have 234 pages containing 500 signed affidavits alleging 11,000 incidents of potential voter fraud. Reporting for the news with Rick Sanchez, Natasha Sweet, RT.
And now over to the Biden camp, trying to put the election behind them, they say, and focus on their White House transition. NRS correspondent Farron Franzak outlines what Democrats are focused on and shows us the newest member of the Biden-Harris team.
This is a red alert and all hands on deck, but it should have been a long time ago.
While Republicans are still playing defense in the 2020 election aftermath.
And what are they doing now? Continuing to ignore in spite of these numbers.
Democrats are on offense, moving on from the election to tackling the latest COVID-19 spike across the country.
The Republicans should stop their shenanigans about an election that President Trump has already lost and focus their attention on the immediate issue at hand, providing relief to a country living through the COVID health and economic crises.
Called in to lead the effort, Ron Klain as President-elect Joe Biden's chief of staff. Dubbed the Ebola czar, Klain served under the Obama-Biden administration as the coordinator to the Ebola response during the 2014 outbreak. Klain tweeting, "I'm honored by the president-elect's confidence and will give my all to lead a talented and diverse team in a Biden-Harris White House." As the Biden-Harris transition team continues to sort through their list of potential cabinet members, progressives are jockeying to get some of their own in the West Wing. One of them?
But if he asked you to join the cabinet as labor secretary, would you say yes?
If I had a portfolio that allowed me to stand up and fight for working families, would I do it? Yes, I would.
Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders has reportedly started making phone calls to union chiefs asking for their support if Biden were to pick Sanders as the labor secretary.
In lock, stock, every step of his way, he's always stood with workers, always stood for workers' rights. And if you look at the platforms that he talks about every single day, minimum wage and more access and protecting workers and these trade deals that send our jobs overseas. Like, this is the one person who would be absolutely perfect.
No final decision yet, but Biden's new chief of staff saying he looks forward to assembling a talented and diverse team to work in the White House as they tackle their ambitious agenda for change and seek to heal the divides in our country. Democrats still urge the team that will take over January 20th to have Democratic senators stay put until after the Georgia special election, where 2 Senate seats are up for grabs. Democrats hoping to not only take back the White House, but take back the Senate to stack up against Republicans and run all 3 branches of government. For the News with Rick Sanchez, I'm Farron Franzak.
Thanks, Farron. Joining us now to discuss this is Michael Voris, author and founder of ChurchMilitant.com, and talk radio host and civil rights attorney Robert Patillo. Hey, Robert, let me begin with you. What do you make of the fact that Karl Rove, probably one of the sternest of all Republicans, the least person who's ever been willing to give up on an election, fought hard during the Bush election victories and loss? What do you make of the fact that he came out today and penned an op-ed saying the gig is up, it's over, Joe Biden won?
Well, I think that's where almost everybody in America outside of the Republican Party is right now. Other than a couple rogue conspiracy theorists, everyone understands that Joe Biden won a clear mandate from the people. He has an over 5 million vote lead over President Trump. Once the voting is done, it could grow to 7 million votes. Depending on how the Electoral College comes out, he may end up with 306 votes in the Electoral College. So he has a clear mandate from the American people. All these other things are distractions. The Democratic Party has moved on to worrying about January 5th here in my home state in Georgia and ensuring they are able to take back the Senate. The longer the president continues on this delusional rant and all these sidetracks that takes attention away from this race, the harder it's going to be for Kelly Loeffler and for David Perdue to win on January the 5th. So I think that the Republican Party would do well to tell him to stop what he's doing currently and concentrate on trying to maintain the Senate if they really want to keep his agenda and Trumpism alive and well in the next several years.
Michael, let me bring you in. What do you make of that? What do you make of the idea that Robert suggests that Republicans should tell Mr. Trump to go ahead and concede for the sake of 2 senatorial potential victories in Georgia?
Oh, I think if he did something like that, I think that would sink the Republicans in Georgia. Look, this has not been a fair fight. As members of the media, at least 2 of us here, we know very good and well what's been going on for 4 years, the constant, maligning and everything else. This was the entire swamp fighting back against Trump even before he was inaugurated, even before he won. This has been going on. And what has been going on is this man has fought for the little people, for the Whole America First program, which stands in stark contrast to the Democratic Socialists. And, apologies to anybody who was a Democrat 40, 50 years ago, but I'm sorry, that party is the party of the socialists now. And there is no way this man, Donald Trump, is going to cede anything to them. And I think if he did, I think that would absolutely sink any Republican hopes of winning either of those 2 seats in Georgia. This is a fight. He's doing exactly what he has every legitimate right to do, and he should pursue it to the absolute end.
Robert Patillo, are you a socialist?
No, I'm actually a free market capitalist who's also pro-life and pro-gun, small business owner. I'm trying to understand this caricature of Democrats that Republicans have tried to run against, and that's why they have only won 1 election this century, because they continue to fight against these boogeymen which do not exist instead of focus on the bread and butter issues that the American people are worried about. There was no Republican plan on education in the 2020 election. There was no Republican plan on Social Security or Medicare. There was no Republican plan on the labor market or helping the environment. Instead, they ran on this idea of fighting against a far left-wing cabal which was against them, and that's not what the American people care about. So continue to run that race, and we will elect John Ossoff, we will elect Raphael Warnock, we will elect Daniel Blackman, we will take back the Senate, and we'll be able to actually put some of those policies in place as long as you're off running against conspiracy land.
Michael, what do you make of that accusation that maybe name-calling against the other side is not what's going to win elections?
Well, I'm not sure calling somebody what they are is name calling. I mean, if I were to call either of you gentlemen males, is that calling you names? I mean, that's what you are. And, Robert may be a little bit less socialist in his approach to things because he ticked off a couple of issues there at the beginning. But let's face it, the party leadership is socialist. The entire Democratic Party right now is having a blood sport over AOC trying to take control of everything, and not just her specifically, but in the House and everything she stands for. And they're on the remember when the Congresswoman in Florida who barely eked out her seat, she's the one who got on and said, not me, she's the one who got on that conference call and said we should never mention socialism again.
Michael Voris, my thanks to you, and my thanks to you as well, Robert Patillo, for the conversation. And that's our news for now. We're going to be staying on top of a lot of the developments that we've been following for you. By the way, a new development on a policy the Trump administration has just established, a new policy established against investors in the United States who dare do business with certain firms in China. It's a controversial story that we're going to be following for you here as a program note throughout the course of the day, as well as the results of the U.S. election and the back and forth that continues there. I'm Rick Sanchez. We'll be looking for you throughout the day here, where it's time to do news again.